am a lawyer, but I am not necessarily your lawyer. The materials discussed in this podcast are for informational purposes only and should not be deemed legal advice. If you have a specific legal question according to your circumstances, then I encourage you to speak with an attorney licensed in your jurisdiction. Welcome back to another edition of Ag Law Today, and we've got Laura Vaught all the way from Tennessee. Laura, why don't you introduce yourself to our listeners? Tell us a little bit about who you are, where you are, and what you do.
Yeah, so my name's Laura Vaught. I grew up just outside of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, which is right in the middle of Tennessee near Nashville. I grew up on a dairy farm and then studied agriculture in college before I eventually went to law school. I worked for our state Department of Agriculture for a couple of years, and now I've been in private practice for a couple of years. I represent businesses of all kinds in the areas of real estate and just general business issues like business formation, but I also do estate planning and probate. And other similar matters in my law practice.
So, Laura, I was thinking about today in anticipation of this recording that we had met several years ago. You were actually in law school at the time, and you were spearheading an agriculture law conference there at the University of Tennessee, and I was there speaking that day. And I was curious, Laura, what made you want to go to law school in the first place?
Yeah, so being a lawyer was never really my goal. Even when I was in college, I went to grad school right after college as well, but I was interested in policy. And I interned in Washington, D.C., and then I came back and worked for our State Farm Bureau, the Tennessee Farm Bureau Federation, for their public affairs team. And I spent my first few months going to the state capitol every day and communicating with lawmakers about certain bills and how they impacted farmers and what the outcome could be if a bill passed or how it might impact farmers or other ag businesses. And I really enjoyed that. And I noticed in my work with the Farm Bureau that a lot of people who had jobs that I thought might be interesting had law degrees. They may not be practicing in the traditional sense, but they had a law degree and they were drafting legislation and advising members. And I thought that was really interesting. Again, even at the time when I decided to go to law school, I said I'll never be a practicing attorney. I'll never be in a law firm, but I've ended up in a law firm and I really enjoyed private practice too. So really it was the Farm Bureau and their policy team that got me into wanting to study the law.
So Laura, I don't know about you, but I hear a lot from like high school students and college students who are interested in going to law school and being an ag lawyer. And I guess my question for you is what is the biggest advice that you give to people who are considering going to law school and being an ag lawyer?
I have told people that they should major in something that interests them in college. A good thing about law school, if you want to be a lawyer, is that you don't have to have a certain degree. It's not like going to medical school where you need to have a degree in chemistry or biology. You can really have any degree and go to law school. And I think that if you study something besides English or literature or political science, you get a handle on a certain industry or a certain customer or client that you're going to have in the future, and you understand their business better. And I think that you should go major in something that you enjoy, but also take classes that are going to expand your critical thinking, your ability to reason and write, and that'll set you up well for law school. I think the fact that I had a diverse background and also worked before I went to law school made law school more challenging in some ways, but it also made me I had more experience before I went to law school, and I think that was a positive thing.
And that's really good advice. I mean, I know for me, when looking back at that period, I mean, I feel like I was in such a rush whenever I was 21, 22, 23, 24 years of age. Like I just always wanted to get to the next chapter. And, I got a master's degree before I went to law school. So I wasn't 22 when I went to law school, but I hadn't been out in the real world yet. And I feel like looking back at my law school experience, my classmates who had real world experience, just they carried that maturity with them in every conversation and every classroom lecture that I didn't have, you know.
I'm sure you get this question a lot, maybe in real life and in law school, but I got the question a lot of, why would an animal science major want to go to law school? Why does it matter if you go to law school? What are you going to do with that combination of things? And I had to spend a lot of time thinking about my answers to that, because I didn't just want to be snarky, but I wanted to have a real answer. And I think because I had real world experience, and especially that Farm Bureau policy experience, I was able to articulate, what happens in the courtroom does matter to farmers. They're businesses too. And everything that we study, from torts to contracts, really impacts farmers as well. In fact, you may remember this case. There's a really famous contracts case that has to do with the purchase and sale of a cow and whether or not she was bred. And I had the opportunity with my animal science degree to explain to my whole first year section of law school how you tell if a cow is bred. And, I became the agriculture girl. And I think that it was a funny story, and it's still a funny story, but I became, in a lot of people's minds, an expert on agriculture. And that opened up conversations for me that all 3 years to have about agriculture and why it's important to our state and our nation. So
yeah, that's hilarious, Laura, because I remember that case. I think I almost remember the cow's name. It's had something to do with
Rose the second of Aberloan.
Yes, and I did the exact same thing to my contracts class as well. So I think that every law school class needs a farm girl in the classroom to educate the community for sure.
Yeah, and even in law school, I ended up doing the National Animal Law Competition, and I did it on legislative drafting and lobbying. So I didn't do traditional moot court, but I used my law degree and my animal science degree in that competition. And even now, there are so many issues with animals, and clients can call me and say they have an issue with a livestock contract, and I understand not only the implications of the contract, but why it's important to their farm and what certain terms mean. And that means a lot to clients, because they're not having to explain something to an attorney who may or may not understand their way of life. So,
right. So today, Laura, we're talking about helping beginning farmers, whether or not that is a farmer in rural America, or I'm recording today from a hotel room in New York City, and I know urban agriculture is also a growing industry. I mean, I know whenever I was in law school here, they were starting to have some rooftop farms and backyard farming as well. So Laura, my question for you is what advice do you give to beginning farmers before they even start planting or producing any animals at all, like in the very infancy of their farming enterprise?
Yeah, if I could take a step back, I'm going to talk a little bit about why this impacts me and what I sort of see in my practice before I jump into that specifically. So I'm in Rutherford County, it borders Davidson County, which is where Nashville is. And so Nashville has traditionally been a small city, but in the last really 15 years, it's grown quite a bit. My county has grown quite a bit. There were many more farms when I was growing up in my county than there are now. And for years, it was one of the fastest growing counties in the nation. So that brought about challenges for existing farms. Without a doubt, it brought about challenges for those existing farms, but it also gave them new opportunities. And especially in my area, but especially in Nashville and all the areas around Nashville, where someone who inherited land in that area that was used for one purpose can now make it an agritourism farm, or they can have any type of direct sales or pick your own or CSA, and there are many more opportunities because there's more people living there to sell directly to. And so when I'm working with either a beginning farmer, so it could be someone who's younger than me or around my age, or maybe they're doing this as a second career and they're in my area, I tell them what the law is on certain things in Tennessee. Agriculture often has a lot of exemptions from traditional laws in every state. There's things like a right to farm law and agritourism law, things that can limit your liability, but you have to know how to take advantage of those things. And so I advise clients to get a handle on what the state law is, but also what local law is, and what the local government can and cannot restrict them on, and what they need to know about their local government, especially in those urban areas, because they might have more hurdles to jump over to get going in a business.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, I love Nashville, and I don't think I grew up appreciating Nashville as much as I do, lately. And I feel like it's has most certainly has grown a lot. I can only imagine that the outskirts of that type of metropolitan area would certainly see a lot of growth as well in the population, and that certainly affects agriculture in a very big way. So going back to my original question,
Mhm.
when people kind of walk through the door and they're sitting down and having a consultation with you, and they're basically like, you know, I want to become a farmer. What's your big advice that you give to them? I know that you said to get updated on these various issues, but the thing is, Laura, and this is also the challenge of being an ag lawyer, is that you and I both know that there are so many different types of law and regulations that impact ag. So
Yeah.
how do you help the beginning farmer navigate that?
I think it's really important in that initial, first of all, a lot of people are already sort of on the path of being a farmer before they ever come talk to me. I don't know that I've ever had a client come to me and say, I want to become a farmer. I haven't purchased any land and we get to start from scratch. So that would be a dream. But oftentimes people come to me when they already sort of have an issue to work through, which is fine. But I think knowing what your client's goals are, and having them be really clear about what their goals are. What's the goal for the immediate term? What do I
Mhm.
eventually want to do with this land? And I think that if we can get clear on what their goals are, that helps me navigate through specific issues that they might have, from a liability standpoint, or complying with a regulation, or keeping a watch on a local board and what they're going to pass, and really knowing whether something might be a good idea for them or not.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I mean, I do feel like sometimes people are coming to me for the first time, and they're perhaps thinking about being, a farmer, or trying to work through the issues. But by and large, like they're either they're in it, or perhaps they're negotiating a farm lease for their very first time.
Mhm.
And um, and even in that instance, we have a distinct issue to think about. So, in thinking about the myriad of issues that affect farmers in general, right? Like, what do you think are like the biggest ones that if someone was going to focus on, like, let's say, like the big three or a big five issues, something along those lines, what would be the biggest on your mind?
So I would say the phone calls I get the most are questions about, I'm going to kind of group these together and say fencing and borders, and
Mm,
what the implications are for who owns what land and whose responsibility it is to keep up a certain fence, and what happens if my cows get out, or what happens if my neighbor's cows get out. And
yeah.
just that general neighbor question of where's the border, whose fence is that, that sort of question. I also get a lot of questions about third parties' rights to use land, and that often comes in the form of easements. So if someone has, ingress and egress are the most common easements, but what are the implications and responsibilities of the parties regarding easements? Once again, that's a neighbor issue generally, and the third party using someone else's land. Estates. This is a really big deal, because they're so hard to talk about. It's so hard to talk about your own demise, and
Why? Why,
it's
Laura? Why is it? Tell
I've
me.
had some people tell me that they think it's going to bring about their own death if they plan for it, which I think is an interesting way. But a lot of it comes down to people just don't want to have hard conversations, and it's really difficult, I think, for farm families to say, we want all three children to inherit equally But at the same time, that makes it harder for the farm to stay together or think about business continuity. And it's just hard to have those conversations. And sometimes either estate planning or dealing with an estate after the fact is really difficult because conversations haven't been had. But if people are proactive, it's a lot easier to navigate those things when they happen. So I would say those are the big three.
Yeah.
I would also say adding a fourth one is local governments. And this has to do with exactly the area I'm in. Like I said before, in Tennessee, agriculture has certain exemptions, but local governments they're not always familiar with them, especially if they're in a more urban county or if, say, for instance, in my county, the representatives that are on local boards and commissions are not from a rural area, so they don't understand exactly the issues that face farmers. And so I think those challenges from local governments and how to apply state law, and as agriculture changes and agritourism becomes more popular, how do certain things apply to these types of agriculture that weren't really in anyone's mind when certain laws were passed, and how do we work through that? I think those are really the big ones that I get phone calls about.
So in trying to work through these four issues sort of one by one, Laura, if you don't mind, starting with the fencing issue. By the way, one of the things that I always encourage my clients to do when they're buying a farm is to get the property surveyed.
Mm-hmm.
But what are your thoughts if somebody owns a farm and do you think if it's never been surveyed, then they should go ahead and get it surveyed and look at the fence lines?
I almost always recommend a survey when someone's buying a property, especially an extensive property like this and that borders a lot of other landowners. I just bought almost 10 acres, which is not a lot of land, but it borders 7 other properties. And so I had to have it surveyed for my lender, but it was good for me to get it surveyed because some lines weren't where fences were. And so we had to work through a couple of issues with a couple of landowners that were easier to work through because we had a clear survey. And so I always recommend that. You need to know what you're buying, and you need to know a survey is also a really good way to spot potential issues that you can't always spot by just looking at the land, but you can spot them by looking at the land, but also looking at a survey at the same time.
So help me walk through that. Let's just say a client expends the money, they get a survey, and things are off in one way, shape, or form, right? Perhaps they're encroaching on their neighbor is encroaching on them, vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
What's sort of the next step after
Sometimes we can get issues like that fixed after the fact with a survey if there hasn't been one before a purchase, or just through the neighbors coming to some agreement. But sometimes it ends up in a small lawsuit in general sessions or circuit or chancery here in Tennessee. But um, those issues come up a lot because land will be owned by the same family for decades on both sides, 2 neighbors, and they just sort of go about with an understanding. And then if new owner comes along and gets it surveyed and the line's in a different spot, it can create some real tension. And so um, a lot of times we can get, neighbors can work those things out. But sometimes we do have to have a small lawsuit over it.
Yeah, I've got a few of those right now, Laura, dealing with some property boundary issues. The other fence issue that you just mentioned was about livestock getting out. So do you want to tell me a little bit more about that issue?
Yeah, so this is an issue that I didn't really study in law school. It's not something that's super common for you to study in law school, but it's something that farmers have a lot of questions about. And I write a column for our Tennessee Cattlemen's Magazine, and I started writing I wanted to write one month's column about fence law. And as I started researching fence law, we have a lot of statute in our state about what is a legal fence and how farmers can take advantage of an exception from liability. And there's a lot to be said about fence law, especially in our state. And so I started giving talks about it. We have a master beef producer program in our state, and I started giving talks about it. And my talk has evolved over time as I've had interactions with farmers about specific fence issues. And so in our state, we have a state statute that it lists what's a legal fence, and it also allows a farmer to have a fence that is commonly used for whatever type of livestock that they own. But if they have a fence, we're a fence-in state. There's fence out and fence in. I think almost everywhere is probably a fence-in state. We're a fence-in state, which means if I own the animal, I'm responsible for the animal. I need to have a fence up to keep my animal in. If my animal gets out because I don't have a good fence, or I'm not paying attention to what's going on my farm, then I have the liability for that animal if it gets out. But if I have a lawful fence and don't have any issues with it, then generally I'm exempt from liability if the animal gets out due to someone else hitting the fence or there's a storm that comes through. And so we talk through a lot of those issues. We also talk through partition fences, which is a fence between two properties, and who's responsible for keeping up the fence, and how the neighbors split that responsibility. There are a lot of potential fence issues that come up.
And moving on to the second issue that you just mentioned, which was easements. So what are the biggest issues that come across your desk as it relates to that?
Yeah, so we've seen, because our county has grown so much, we've seen a lot of land that's been subdivided into a traditional subdivision, but we also have a lot of land in our area that gets divided into 5 to 20 acre lots. And it's people that want to have a few horses or a few cows, and they have a smaller plot of land and they're maybe a small farmer. But during that, because there's limited road frontage, there will be an easement across one tract to get to another, that involves, someone putting their driveway across another tract of land. And then if there's not a well-written easement agreement or driveway agreement, then the parties can sometimes have a dispute over who can use the driveway, in what manner can they use the driveway, who's responsible for keeping up the driveway, and those potential issues can come up a lot too. Often they are rooted in a legal issue, but they can involve a lot of emotions as well. And so we see those a lot.
So in skipping over to the third issue on estate planning, I know that we've had a lot of different podcasts on this particular issue, and I certainly, don't want to delve too deep on that particular topic for our conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious, Laura, what are your thoughts on trying to give farm families that are having difficulty having this conversation, trying to get it going?
I think I'm going to sound like a lawyer. I think it depends on the family. I think it depends on, what the assets are there, what child wants to continue farming, if all the children want to continue farming or if they don't. But I would say having the current asset owner, so if it's the land or if it's a business that's leasing land, having them sit down with a neutral third party like a lawyer, to help them think about possibilities might be eye-opening to them and might help them have a conversation with their family, because there are possibilities that they don't even know about. And so I think that starting with a neutral third party who doesn't have an interest in who inherits the land, but can be a trusted advisor, would be a good starting point if you just don't know what to do.
Yeah,
but sorry, I didn't mean to talk over.
I think that's great advice. And, something I just want to add is that, I'm an agriculture mediator, and there's various agriculture mediation programs across the country, some of which are trying to give funding to add estate planning mediation onto the list of things that they do, which is typically restricted to right to farm and then also USDA federal farm program dispute. So I really hope that the various agriculture mediation programs from coast to coast can sort of expand those programs to allow that third party neutral to have that discussion. Of course, there are both attorney and non-attorney mediators that can also be hired to be that neutral third party. But I just wanted to note that as an
Yeah,
additional option. And I'm sorry, Laura, I cut you off. Did you have additional
that's
thoughts?
okay. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that estate planning, it's something that we get from all aspects of agriculture. My dad has been a farmer his entire career. After he went to college, he started farming full time. And my nephew is the fourth generation to be involved with that farm. And so I think that this is a good example of something that hits across all farm families. But if someone who currently owns an asset is really proactive in this area, they can help prevent issues for the next generation. So we're talking about farming in an urban area or taking advantage of a new opportunity or being a beginning farmer. If they are really proactive in this area and know what parties want, they can help prevent some issues for whoever wants to farm it next. So if my mom and dad are really great about their estate planning and they know what each child wants to do potentially in agriculture, they can do their estate plan in a way that helps me achieve my future goals in agriculture, but also my brother's future goals in agriculture. And if they don't have goals in agriculture, then maybe they don't need to be left an interest in the farm because it causes more headache later. But if
Yeah.
farm families are really great about this, that takes a big chunk of an issue away for a beginning farmer. Even if I were to start farming today, even though I've lived on a farm the majority of my life, I would be considered a beginning farmer, and access to capital would still be an issue for me. And access to land. But if my mom and dad do a great job of leaving me land, then that's a big issue that's taken care of that I don't have to think about. And so that's a way to help land stay available for the next generation.
And then I know that you said that the fourth big topic was sort of like government regulation or local regulation. Along those same lines, Laura, I feel like in the last decade or so, give or take, direct farm marketing has become sort of a hot topic or a big issue for beginning farmers. So do you want to tell me a little bit more about that issue and what you've seen specifically there in Tennessee?
Did you say direct marketing, Carrie?
Yeah, direct farm
Okay.
marketing, like farmers markets, CSA.
You broke up a little bit. Sorry. Yeah, so I think additional risk and new challenges to work through that maybe someone like my dad doesn't have to work through because he's generally not selling to the public. Um, but you have to think about additional things. So there's additional regulation. If you're going to be selling meat to a consumer, it has to be processed in a USDA facility. But there's also a lot of opportunity there because you get a bigger chunk of the dollar that the consumer spends. And so I think that farmers who want to do this thing, they have to think about the regulation on the farm itself, but they have to think about the food regulation and the regulation that impacts selling to a consumer. And so those are potential issues, but there's also a lot more risk. There's a lot more people that have the potential to sue you or have a complaint against you in some way. And so thinking through those issues is also really important. The other thing is that, especially in my area, if you're going to be doing business and actually doing the farming in an area where this is a great opportunity for you because there's a lot of people, those people also, you have more neighbors. So you have more people who might be upset about what happens on your farm regarding smell or sound or dust. And so you have the potential for more.
All right, Laura, to close, I'm wondering what other types of professionals that you think that would be helpful for farmers to work with, such as like maybe an accountant or an insurance agent.
Those are definitely two great ones. Accountants, insurance agents. I always recommend working with an accountant when I'm working with estate planning or real estate transactions, just to make sure there's no, and even business formations, just to make sure there's no negative tax implications, especially. Um, Insurance agents are great too to help manage risk. They can help you know what your policy covers and help you think about risk from a legal standpoint, and also how you might use that insurance to protect you in the future as well. I would also say this is kind of a little bit different than what you're asking, but part of a local chamber, especially if the local chamber has an agriculture or food committee or group, because you might get introduced to other business professionals that can either help you or be good business partners for you, or people who are good customers for you. And it might help you think through different markets for your products. So, for example, something's happening a lot in Nashville because Nashville's grown so much, is there's a lot of whiskey distilling going on, and there's a lot of opportunity for farmers to sell grain to have a totally Tennessee made alcoholic beverage. And that's something that wasn't happening even 5 years ago. And so I think the more you know people who are outside traditional agriculture circles, the more your own wheels in your brain might start to turn about what are the opportunities for me as a farmer, and how might I use my local economy to leverage my own goals.
Yeah, that's great advice. I mean, I'm a big fan of Chamber of Commerce. I also have been heavily involved in an organization called BNI over the years, which
Yeah.
stands for Business Networking International, which is probably a lot less popular for farmers, but I think it would most certainly be a great complement to the chambers. So, Laura, to close, how can people find you? Are you online? Are you involved in social media?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook, just using my name, Laura Vaught, Vaught. And then you can also find me on my firm's website. I'm a lawyer at Caius, Rogers, Barger, Holder, and King in Murfreesboro. Thankfully, our web address is only krbhk.com.
Great. Thanks for coming today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.